Tonight in the This Week studio, we ask if Labour and Neil Kinnock have a future in government. Neil Kinnock, 5 years ago when you took over the leadership with that rousing conference speech, do you remember you said, we have to win, we can win, we will win. You can't have seen yourself where you are today. Are you disappointed?
I don't like losing, and that's a source of disappointment, obviously. But as you may recall, what I said in that speech, and in one or two others, is that winning is up to us. It requires a degree of self-discipline and an eye to the future. And unless we have those qualities, then we're not going to be believed, and we're not going to be the cohesive force necessary to earn victory, because I believe that victory should be earned. And there's been a problem from time to time in that last 5 years in which we haven't had the self-discipline, the cohesion, or the eye to the future necessary to give us the ingredients of victory. That is being repaired. We will on the next occasion, but it doesn't make up for lost time.
Isn't that a bit blaming it on the troops? What if they blame it on you?
No, I'm prepared to take any share of the blame that can be fairly allocated to me. But it is self-evident that, as I've had occasion to say on previous occasions, in politics you need a majority to win. You only need a loudmouth minority to lose, since they, particularly if they're in the Labour movement, get the attention. And all of the striving can go on, and all of the constructive work can go on, and all of the unity can be developed if there is evidence of breach, of contention, of opposition. That is enlarged and magnified, and it undermines the public confidence in the Labour Party and the willingness to support us. So it isn't a question of blaming the troops, it's describing the reality as it has existed.
Does it not undermine your own confidence in yourself, though? I mean, when you came in as leader, and there were great hopes, you must have had great hopes. At that stage, the party was something like 36% in the polls, and it's now 34%. That's a 2% drop for 5 hard years' work. Are there not times when you really don't want to get up in the morning?
No, it's actually not the case, if polls matter in that degree. When I became leader of the Labour Party in 1983, Labour standing in the polls was 24.5%. It now regularly clocks the upper 30s, sometimes 40%. And I don't think that's the only way of measurement, but that certainly is a significant shift. Now, as far as my confidence is concerned, I was always confident, I am always confident in my own tenacity and my will to win. And that's communicated in the movement, and it's necessary, because nobody's going to bring us a gift of victory. We've got to work for it ourselves.
All the same, for an awful lot of ordinary people looking at the Labour Party, the extraordinary thing now, for those of us, for instance, who remember the 60s, the extraordinary thing now is that when people talk about the Labour Party, they talk about a party struggling with the past, an old-fashioned party, a party with old-fashioned ideas. Isn't it ironic that now, when people think of radicalism and a readiness to change quickly, they don't think of your party, they think of Mrs. Thatcher?
It isn't just ironic, it's eccentric. And the first thing is, of course...
But they do.
Well, yes, and I'd be interested to explore it further. As far as the Labour Party is concerned, we are the party that's thrown off the past, not in terms of our values and our convictions, but in terms of a lot of the shibbolets that have dominated the party for decades and have become out of gear with the expectations and demands of the modern British people. And it's we are doing and have been doing that. So far as Mrs. Thatcher is concerned, there is a reversion to a pre-Churchillian form of conservatism, one that pays no respect to consensus, one that is centralising, one that uses patronage, one that imposes poll taxes, and one, of course, that's got itself into terrible economic difficulty. Now, the problem is, as you describe, in politics, not actually what happens, but what is perceived to happen.
And what
our task is to improve that perception.
But what people perceive, what people see, is you spending precious, precious time and energy fighting battles to make the party lose what you yourself call the shibbolets of the past. I mean, define for us what the shibbolets are as you see them.
The view that did predominate, was never a majority view in the Labour Party, but did predominate, that the typical Labour voter was a man in a boiler suit with a third-hand car, who had all his holidays in Britain, had a wife who was a dependent, worked a 48-hour week, and lived in a council house. And of course, not only is that very patronising about people, and including many very loyal Labour supporters, but was so focused on a system and a grouping that had virtually ceased to exist, that it led Labour in many respects, certainly in its general policy propositions, into a cul-de-sac that possibly wasn't right in the past, but certainly wasn't looking to the future.
Have people been simplistic about the Labour Party's role? I mean, you yourself...
In 25 minutes, you've got to be simplistic, I understand.
Yes, indeed, we have to be simplistic. But, I mean, you yourself have said that the problem with a minority within the party is that they see the party's role as only being there to alleviate dreadful poverty. There are an awful lot of ordinary people and young people who would always have thought that's what the Labour Party is for.
And we are, because of the fact that if we are not concerned about the have-nots, about the wretched, about the homeless, about the poor, about those inadequately housed, those who don't get their full opportunities of whatever sex in whatever area, then nobody else is going to be concerned about them and nobody else is going to do anything for them. The argument is whether we should exclusively be dedicated to trying to help the have-nots, or whether we should realise, as I counsel, that if we are going to help the have-nots as we want to help them, we are going to have to get the support of the haves and the haven't got enoughs as well. And that's why, consequently, there is the strongest political and, if you like, ideological socialist argument for spreading our appeal, ensuring that it is related to the times in which we live and the future that we face, and not simply a series of memories about the past or a very sympathetic but powerless attention to those who we most want to help in society, who are increasing, of course, in number wherever year that Thatcherism that passes.
Well, looking to Mrs Thatcher, as you must do, of course, every day, do you think Mrs Thatcher has done anything right? Brian Gould has talked about the fact that at least she did destroy, and there was a necessary destruction involved, some of the economic consensus of the 60s and 70s. He gave her that much credit.
I don't think if you read what he was saying, he was intending to give credit. He was commenting...
Well, he was, reluctantly.
No, he was commenting on...
he did.
He was commenting on what could be called the breaking of a mould. And although that mould sometimes gave the impression of being a little staid, a little bit outdated, the fact was it was the basis of stability, of mutual respect, and many other values in Britain. Now, as far as Mrs Thatcher is concerned, I look back over 10 years. I see a deterioration, a great deterioration in our international trade position. I see the spread of poverty. I see the fact that we are underfunding housing, that we've got a health service that constantly teeters on the brink of underfunding, and a host of other indicators, both in terms of experience and exchange with people and in terms of statistics. And I really can't see how there can be a claim to any form of credit or greatness, especially when, in each of those 10 years, Mrs Thatcher has had £10 billion worth of oil revenues that no other government in British history has ever had, and no other competitor government has got.
Yes, but I mean, isn't the fact of the matter that she is setting the agenda for you? I mean, if we take a whole series of issues like the economy and the acceptance more of the market economy, like Europe and a readiness to get involved in discussions for closer cooperation in Europe, like unilateralism, at least we get the impression there's going to be a move on that front. It would seem as though you are running all the time to catch up with the pace that she's setting.
No, that's not the case, but I think it must inevitably be acknowledged that in politics a great deal of activity is action and response. And it can truly be said of any government that to an extent they are setting an agenda. There are parts of that agenda that Mrs Thatcher isn't very keen on. And of course, I do mean the balance of payments deficit, which is vast, and an assortment of other problems associated with it, like record interest and mortgage rates. Other parts of what she is doing naturally require us to argue and criticise and resist, like water privatisation, electricity privatisation, the poll tax, the wreckage that she wants to inflict on the health service.
Yes.
So it's inevitable, to some extent, and I make no apology for it, that a large part of the activity of politics is going to be related not only to criticising the government, but then to presenting the alternatives. That is where we don't match Mrs Thatcher's agenda, because we've got new ideas.
Can I move on to Europe? Let's talk about the change of policy on Europe. You were somebody who campaigned for a no vote in the referendum of 75. You supported an election manifesto in 1983 that said if Labour got into office, it would bring Britain out of Europe within the lifetime of that government. you're now contributing and trying to influence the nature of the closer cooperation between EC states. An enormous change in policy, surely.
Within months, literally, of the 1983 election, I changed Labour Party policy. So that when we fought the 1984 Euro elections, for instance, it was on the basis of a new deal for Europe and a square deal for Britain, recognising that we were in to stay. That argument being resolved. We've had difficulty getting it through to some of the commentators, but that's been where we've stood for the last 5 years. Now, my regret is that we didn't get the opportunity in the years before that to lead the debate about the direction of the European community, which means that there's ground now to make up in terms of the common agricultural policy, in terms of democratic control, in terms of relationships with the East and the South of the world. And that's the argument that we're putting forward now and leading opinion on.
It's a bit like to have regrets. I mean, you were one of the people who would have pushed the argument towards the other side.
Well, of course. And in 1973, when we went into the European community, the warnings that I and people like me made was of a reversal of our trade with the rest of the European community. Can I just demonstrate how that's taking place?
Well, very briefly.
Yes, I will, but it's important because I tell you the truth. The newspaper's never going to report it, so we'll try and get it over on the television. I'm not being paranoid. That is a fact of political life in Britain. Just to give you a measure.
If you can do it in 25 seconds.
I can do it in 24. In 1970, our trade balance with the rest of the European community was 4 billion. By 1979, it was 1 billion. Now, it is a deficit of 14 billion pounds. And what we argued for was a different relationship that would prevent us from being run down in the way that we have and disadvantaged in the way that we are.
Right. We've been hearing voices recently, David Owen's perhaps most recently yesterday, people who left the Labour Party and who joined the SDP on particular issues, like, for instance, the party's attitude on Europe, on question of democracy within the party, on the economy, on defence policy.
You're not describing David Owen now, are you?
Well, indeed I am.
Listen,
but
David Owen bottled out because he didn't have what it took to stand his corner and try and win his argument. Let's understand that. And I'm not disgracing the man because that precisely is what happened.
That's your comment on David Owen. Let's apply it generally to all those who left, about which you might not feel quite as strongly. But the reasons that they left were a series of issues on which they now see you to have moved to their position, including your position on Europe, including what they see as a change in defence policy. That being taken into account, is there any reason why you should not consider some sort of pact, some sort of electoral pact with people who could, if one takes the Democrats and the SDP into account, arrange a non-Thatcher majority?
If individuals leading what remains, for instance, of the SDP want to support us, then that's entirely up to them, and I think they'd be sensible so to do. For people who have voted for the Social Democrats, I think that the recognition that they've got is that there's only one serious alternative to Thatcherism. That is the Labour Party, and that we not only have and are developing policies related to the realities of the present and the future, but we're doing it from a basis of analysis and conscience with which they can identify. That's why the movement in the polls, for instance, since the last general election, has been towards us, and certainly very much away from the so-called centre ground, which is much more marshmallow than centre.
The polls? Polls which put your personal rating at 26% in December, and which still aren't really all that very complimentary. And not just the polls.
They're much more matter of fascination to you than they are to me, I've got to tell you that.
Well, I'm glad you can be that realistic about it, but let's be realistic about something else. I mean, let's talk about what it needs for you to win an outright majority. We're talking about winning 98 seats to get an outright majority. We're talking about winning more than anybody has since the war. We're talking about winning Finchley. Talking about winning seats where you came third last time. Come on.
Yeah, it can be done and will be done, and I'll tell you why. You see, the situation you describe is in the context of a different political situation. We didn't, in all the analogies that can be used about the years before 1979 and so on, face a situation in which we were moving out of a 2.5 or even a 3-party system. Secondly, if you look at those results, you will see that the mere reallocation of 140,000 votes, very small number in Britain, would have added 60 seats to our total in the House of Commons now. And what I'm saying is, I'm not saying that it's an easy task, but I'm saying it is a measurable and achievable task. And realism dictates that you look at it through that lens and not just through the idea of what previously used to be thought of as swings.
If you can win support. But even though polls show all the time that actually there's not a majority of support among people for a lot of pet Thatcher projects, many of the privatisation projects, many of the changes in education and housing, poll tax, for instance, there isn't a majority there. Yet it's not really translating yet into an indication of any sort of win for you. Don't you, as the leader, have to take quite an amount of responsibility for that?
I take the share of responsibility, as I said earlier, that it would fairly be mine. I've no desire to dodge that at all. And like Mrs. Thatcher, I don't blame things on everybody else. But if I can just put it like this, the major challenge to us for some years past has been to link up the instincts of people, as manifested, as you say, through the polls on privatisation, on taxation, on the health service, on moral and social values, on centralisation, a host of other things, in which we have a large poll lead, to link up that instinct with the understanding that Labour can be trusted and counted on to follow through on those instincts. Now, here's the major problem we've got. The credibility break that we've got to make is to get people to understand that we are strong enough, realistic enough, modern enough, democratic socialist enough to be able to perform on those fronts and not just to promise it.
And the point where that really will be shown, I mean, the real crunch point for you, at least the one that's zooming up at the moment, will be the October conference and whether or not you get that policy review through. Now, you have very much pinned your colours to that particular mast. If that policy review, into which you've contributed so much and which you hope for so much, if that doesn't go through, will you feel that your personal position is such that you've got to resign?
It'll go through.
And but what if it doesn't?
It'll go through. No, you can speculate endlessly about that, but the fact is, it will go through.
Would it be possible for you to lead the party if it didn't?
It will go through, and I shall lead the party taking it through to the further extensions so that it's translated into policy that wins the next general election. Can you really imagine, in all reality, that any form of general or leader going into a series of political battles is going to even contemplate the idea of a scenario in which you say, oh, well, if this doesn't work to my absolute satisfaction, I'm going to chicken out.
But particularly a battle
chance
over
of that
which you have some control.
Not a chance of it happening.
Whatever about the party.
And it's because of that.
What about the electorate?
Yes, because of that we will, on the basis that I've argued it, win that policy review, give it to the British people in the form of policy and get their support.
Right, a final question then. If Labour loses its fourth election in a row, your second election in a row, is that the point at which Neil Kinnock says, OK, for the sake of the party, let somebody else take over?
It's a proposition that is totally unsubstantiated. And a situation that will not arise.
By 3 election losses.
I mean, but what contribution of any kind does it make to political dialogue or understanding to speculate about something that is highly unlikely to occur in a few years' time? The last thing that viewers are interested in is that prospect of my future. What they're interested in is their life, their condition, and what future is offered to themselves and their children. And we haven't spent a lot of time talking about that.
What if they think they're listening, as Dr. Johnson said about second marriages, to the triumph of hope over experience?
Well, listen, if we want to exchange Johnson quotes, then they're, generally speaking, not as flattering as they should be to women. So I won't even go into that.
Neil Kinnock, thank you.
Thank you.